The pawnshop clerk sneered as Sarah lifted the battered violin case onto the counter. "This junk isn't worth $10, he laughed completely, unaware that in less than 24 hours, the world's most prestigious orchestra conductor would offer her $500,000 for it. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The pawn shop smelled of cigarette smoke and metal polish, the kind of stale air that seemed to hang heavy with other people's desperation. Sarah Collins stood at the counter, her fingers tightening around the worn handle of the violin case, as if letting go of it would mean letting go of the last piece of her father. She was 37, but in that moment, she felt twice her age. The clerk barely looked at her when she walked in, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone, a smirk already tugging at his lips like he could sense weakness before she even spoke. Bills, stacked at home in unopened envelopes, haunted her thoughts. The electric company had already shut them off once that month, and she knew the final warning sat on the kitchen table waiting for her when she returned. Her daughter Lily needed new shoes, ones that didn't flap open at the soles or pinch her toes. And here she was, holding a relic of better days, hoping to trade memory for survival. The case creaked as she opened it, the hinges stiff with neglect. The violin lay nestled inside, coated in a fine layer of dust. To her, it was beautiful because it was her father's, because she could still see him leaning back in a chair on Sunday afternoons, dancing across strings while he played songs that filled their small house with warmth. To the clerk, it was just wood, cracked varnish, and strings that hadn't been changed in years. He chuckled, a sound so careless it made her stomach twist. "This old thing?" he said, not even hiding his disdain. He reached out, tapped the body with a fingernail, and recoiled with exaggerated disgust. "You'd be lucky to get $10. Nobody plays junk like this anymore." The words cut sharper than she expected. $10. The man didn't know that her father had carried it through moves, kept it wrapped when times were good, cradled it when times were bad. He didn't know that it was the last thing she had left after cancer had taken him, after her marriage had crumbled, after the house she grew up in had been sold. He didn't know. But the indifference in his voice felt like erasure. Like her father's love of music, his quiet passion was worthless. A couple waiting behind her in line glanced at the violin, and then at her, eyes full of that pity that stung worse than laughter. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, humiliation washing over her in waves. She snapped the case shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the small shop. The clerk barely looked up from his phone, already turning to the next customer. She clutched the case to her chest, her heart pounding as she forced herself toward the door. Every step felt heavy, every glance from strangers like a spotlight exposing her desperation. Outside, the afternoon air was damp and gray, and her reflection in the shop window startled her. She looked worn, tired, older than she remembered. For a fleeting moment, she imagined smashing the violin against the pavement, ending the humiliation once and for all. But her father's face came to her then, the way he used to close his eyes while playing, and her grip tightened protectively. She hurried down the street, away from the shop, away from the clerk's mocking smile, away from pity. She didn't know yet that the violin was far from worthless, that its story was only beginning to reveal itself, but she knew she couldn't let go. Not yet, not like this. Back in their tiny rented apartment, Sarah placed the violin case on the scarred kitchen table. The space smelled faintly of yesterday's reheated soup, the single lamp above them flickering. She sank into a chair and stared at the case as though it might open itself and tell her what to do. Lily padded in barefoot, her long hair tangled from sleep, curiosity sparking in her 12-year-old eyes. "Why don't you play it, Mom?" The question was simple, innocent, but it hit like a stone. Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound catching in her throat. "I haven't played in years, honey. Life doesn't leave much room for music." Divorce had taken her stability. Job loss had stripped away her confidence. The endless grind of surviving had drowned out the songs that once filled her days. Music had become something distant, like sunlight remembered on the coldest nights. But as her fingers brushed over the case, memories pushed through the bitterness. She saw her father in their old living room, the vinyl record stacked by his chair, his laughter ringing out when she tried to mimic him. She saw him closing his eyes as bow met string, transforming their cramped house into a concert hall with just a few notes. Those memories tugged at her heart, urging her to try, just once more. She opened the case slowly, reverently. The violin was worn, its wood dulled with age, strings slack. She tightened the bow with hands that shook, set the violin under her chin, and drew the horsehair across the strings. The first sound was rough, a squeak that made her wince. But then she adjusted, tried again, and something fragile, but real, emerged. A trembling note, imperfect but alive. She closed her eyes, let the sound flow, and for a moment the weight of unpaid bills, the cracked plaster walls, and the fear of tomorrow lifted. Lily's eyes widened. She clapped softly, as if afraid to break the spell. "That was beautiful, Mom." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. She hadn't expected the old violin to stir anything more than dust, but the sound had awakened something buried deep inside her, something she thought life had stolen for good. It wasn't just music. It was connection to her father, to herself, to a part of her that still believed in more than just survival. She smiled faintly, setting the violin gently back in its case. She didn't know that this small act, this return to music after years of silence, would set into motion events that would soon turn her humiliation into something far greater. For now, she only knew that for the first time in a long time, her heart felt lighter, as if the music had whispered a promise. Their story wasn't over yet. The next afternoon, Sarah walked through the city with the violin case pressed against her side like a shield. The memory of the pawnshop humiliation clung to her, but somewhere deep inside her chest burned a stubborn ember that refused to be smothered. She told herself she had carried the violin only because she couldn't bear to leave it behind in their tiny apartment, but the truth was more complicated. She wanted to remind herself that her father's legacy wasn't worthless, even if the rest of the world thought otherwise. The downtown plaza was alive with movement. Vendors shouted their specials over the din of traffic, children clutched balloons that bobbed against the gray sky, and a faint drizzle had just begun to mist the air. Sarah kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, until a sharp twang caught her ear. She turned to see a street guitarist fumbling with a broken string, his frustration clear as he muttered curses under his breath. His case lay open at his feet, scattered with coins and a few crumpled bills. Without thinking, Sarah stepped closer. "Do you want accompaniment?" The words slipped out before she could stop herself. The man looked up, startled, his eyes running over her tired face, her cheap coat, the violin case clutched like contraband. For a moment he seemed ready to dismiss her, but then something in her expression must have softened him. He shrugged. "Why not? Let's see what you've got." Her hands shook as she opened the case, fingers brushing across the wood as though to steady herself. She lifted the violin, brought it under her chin, inhaled deeply, and set bow to string. The first notes wavered, but then found strength, growing louder, clearer, richer with each breath she drew. The guitarist strummed softly in rhythm, his earlier frustration forgotten as he listened. Passersby slowed, curiosity pulling them closer. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve. A businessman paused mid-phone call. Within minutes, the drizzle had gathered into a small but spellbound crowd. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the music rise and fall like a tide. She poured into each note everything she had buried over the years, the loneliness of her marriage's collapse, the ache of poverty, the fierce love she felt for Lily. The violin carried it all, singing in a voice that belonged not just to her, but to her father, to every memory tied to this fragile instrument. When the final note hung trembling in the damp air, silence followed. Then the applause came, sudden and thunderous, echoing off the plaza walls. The guitarist grinned and tipped his hat, but Sarah only lowered the violin slowly, her cheeks flushed and her chest heaving. She hadn't felt this alive in years. As the crowd dispersed, one figure lingered at the back. A man in a dark suit, tall, composed, his expression unreadable. Unlike the others, he didn't clap, didn't shout praise. He simply watched. When Sarah began to pack the violin away, he approached with a deliberate calm. Without introducing himself, he slipped a small white card into her hand. His voice was low but steady. "Call me. That violin deserves the stage." Before she could reply, he had turned and walked away, vanishing into the flow of the city. Sarah stared down at the card, her heart thundering, the words of a stranger echoing in her ears. For the first time, she wondered if maybe the pawnshop clerk had been wrong. If maybe this violin wasn't just memory and dust. At home that evening, the card lay on the kitchen table under the flickering light, a puzzle too strange to ignore. Sarah traced the black lettering with a fingertip. Jonathan Mercer, Conductor, New York Philharmonic. Her breath caught. The New York Philharmonic was a name spoken with reverence, a place she had only ever glimpsed on television or heard about from her father when he dreamed aloud. Her hands shook as she held the card. It couldn't be real. Why would someone of that stature notice her, let alone slip her his card? She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as some elaborate prank. Maybe he wasn't who he said he was. Maybe he had been impressed for a moment, and nothing more. Yet the memory of his eyes lingered sharp, assessing, like he had seen something others couldn't. Lily leaned over the table, her hair falling into her face. "Mom, he looked serious," she said, with the certainty only a 12-year-old could have. "You have to call." Sarah shook her head. "Why would a world-famous conductor care about my old violin? It doesn't make sense." But later, after Lily had drifted to sleep, Sarah couldn't resist the tug of curiosity. She opened her laptop, the screen's glow filling the dim room, and typed his name, Jonathan Mercer. The results appeared instantly. Interviews, photographs, videos of grand performances beneath glittering chandeliers. There was no mistaking it. He was real, legitimate, accomplished. Her heart pounded. She clicked a video and watched him command an orchestra with a flick of his baton, the music swelling under his direction. This was not a man who wasted time on games. She sat frozen, staring at the phone on the table. She picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. For nearly an hour, she hovered between fear and temptation, until finally, with her chest tight and palms sweating, she dialed the number. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Deep, warm, commanding. "Mrs. Collins, I was hoping you'd call." Sarah's breath caught. "How did you—" "I was watching today. That violin of yours, it isn't ordinary. Bring it to Lincoln Center tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Before she could respond, the line went dead, leaving her clutching the phone in stunned silence. Lincoln Center. Tomorrow. Her world tilted as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She sat for a long time in the quiet apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the soft breathing of her daughter in the next room. She looked at the violin case resting against the wall, suddenly foreign and yet more familiar than ever. Something was happening, something she couldn't explain. The humiliation of the pawn shop, the applause of strangers, the card from a conductor whose name carried weight across the globe, it all pointed to a truth she was only beginning to grasp. Her life, which had been shrinking with every overdue bill and every closed door, had just cracked open, and through that crack came the possibility of something she had almost stopped believing in, a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Lincoln Center awaited, and with it, an unraveling that would test everything she thought she knew about her father, her violin, and herself. The car rattled as Sarah guided it onto the highway, the gas needle hovering closer to empty than she dared admit. She had counted the crumpled bills in her purse 3 times that morning, calculating and recalculating how far they could get on what little money remained. Beside her, Lily hummed to herself, legs tucked under her, treating the journey like a road trip to the seaside, instead of a desperate gamble into a world Sarah had never belonged to. On the back seat, swaddled in the faded quilt her mother once made, the violin lay silent but commanding, as if it knew the weight of the secret it carried. Sarah gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles pale, her mind spiraling with what-ifs. What if Mercer had been playing some cruel joke? What if she drove all the way to New York only to be laughed out of Lincoln Center the same way she'd been dismissed at the pawn shop? Yet, beneath the fear, a current of defiance stirred. She had nothing left to lose, and everything her father's memory, Lily's future, her own dignity to fight for. The miles stretched on, gray clouds looming overhead, as though the sky itself waited for her decision. Lily handed her a sandwich from the small paper bag they had packed. "It's like a picnic, Mom," she said brightly. Sarah forced a smile. She envied her daughter's ability to turn uncertainty into adventure. She glanced at Lily's hopeful eyes and thought, "For her, I'll walk into that marble palace even if I'm shaking apart inside." By the time the skyline rose ahead, jagged against the dull afternoon light, Sarah's throat tightened. She had only ever seen New York from afar, on television or in passing headlines. The sheer immensity of it pressed down on her chest. Every glass tower seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." She parked the car blocks away from Lincoln Center, afraid of the parking fees she couldn't afford, and they walked hand in hand. The plaza spread before them, grand and unyielding. Water from the central fountain arced gracefully, catching the light like diamonds. Sarah felt her legs weaken, as though each step toward the building was heavier than the last. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and gold accents. She froze, clutching the violin case to her chest. Musicians brushed past her, their polished shoes clicking against the stone, their sleek cases shining with professional pride. Every inch of her screamed imposter. Her coat was threadbare, her shoes scuffed, her palms damp with sweat. Then Mercer appeared. His presence cut through the lobby like a blade. His eyes, sharp and piercing, found hers immediately. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her too, that perhaps she had misread everything. But as he approached, his expression softened. "Follow me," he said, voice low but steady. It was not a request but a command softened by understanding. She obeyed, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. The grand hallway stretched before them, lined with photographs of legends whose names she barely knew, people who had lived their lives in the embrace of music. She felt like she was trespassing, walking where she had no right to be. Yet with every step the violin in her arms seemed heavier, as though it was pulling her forward, demanding to be seen. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the door Mercer would open at the end of that corridor would not just reveal a room. It would reveal the truth of her inheritance, a truth more valuable than she had ever dared to dream. The rehearsal room smelled faintly of polished wood and resin, its walls lined with instruments she could not name but instinctively respected. Mercer guided her inside, his steps measured, deliberate. Another man was waiting. He was older, his back slightly stooped, but his eyes shone with razor-sharp intelligence. He wore a white lab coat and thin cotton gloves, like a surgeon, about to begin delicate work. "Mrs. Collins," Mercer said formally, "this is Dr. Hines, one of the foremost violin appraisers in the world." Sarah blinked, uncertain. Appraiser? The word tasted strange on her tongue. She hadn't thought of her father's violin as anything that required such expertise. The two men exchanged a glance, unspoken meaning passing between them. Dr. Hines stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "Please," he said gently. "May I?" Her fingers tightened around the case. For years she had guarded this violin as nothing more than a memory, a relic of her father's love for music. Now, she was asked to hand it over to strangers, to trust them with the last piece of him she possessed. Her throat tightened, but finally she nodded, setting the case on the table and flipping open the latches with trembling hands. The violin gleamed faintly under the lights, its varnish dulled but dignified. "Doctor," Hines leaned close, eyes narrowing as he studied the scroll, the curve of the F-holes, the subtle hue of the varnish. His gloved fingers traced along the neck with reverence. His breath hitched, and in the quiet room the sound was startling. "It can't be," he murmured. His voice cracked with awe. He pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket and angled the violin under the light. Sarah's pulse hammered as she watched him tilt it, searching for something hidden within its aging wood. His gloved thumb paused near the neck, where faint engraving had been worn down over time. He inhaled sharply. When he lifted his gaze to hers, his expression was transformed, disbelief and reverence mingling in his eyes. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, almost reverently, This is a Stradivarius, one of the lost instruments. The words slammed into her. Her knees weakened, and she clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. What? Dr. Hines straightened, his voice firmer now. A Stradivarius violin, crafted in the early 1700s by Antonio Stradivari himself, one of history's greatest masters. These instruments are treasures few remain in the world. Their sound is unmatched, their worth. He hesitated, then continued. Estimated value conservatively, $500,000. Sarah's vision blurred. She staggered back, nearly dropping into a chair. 500,000? The same violin she had carried through rain and poverty? The same violin she had nearly pawned for $10? Her mind reeled, colliding with the absurdity. Mercer stepped closer, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. I told you, that violin deserves the stage. Sarah pressed her palms to her face, fighting for breath. Fortune, legacy, memory, all wrapped in the wood she had once thought ordinary. The humiliation in the pawn shop, the pitying stares, all of it shattered by the truth that had lived in her hands all along. Her father had left her more than love. He had left her a treasure hidden in plain sight. And now, whether she wanted it or not, her life had changed forever. Sarah couldn't move. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing inward as Mercer's words hung between them like smoke. $500,000. The number was so large, so impossible, that her mind stumbled over it, unable to comprehend what it truly meant. That kind of money could erase every notice stacked on the kitchen table at home, every late fee, every sleepless night spent wondering how she would make rent. It could give Lily everything she had dreamed of, giving her new shoes that didn't blister her feet, a room of her own, the promise of a college education. It was salvation, gift-wrapped and placed before her in the shape of a wire transfer. And yet her hands gripped the violin case as though someone were trying to rip it away from her. The wood under her fingers wasn't just an instrument, it was her father's memory pressed into her palms, a connection to the man who had filled her childhood with music, even when they had nothing. Selling it felt like betrayal, like selling a piece of her father to the highest bidder. It's not just an instrument, she whispered, the words almost drowned by the pounding in her ears. It was his. Mercer's eyes softened for just a moment, though his jaw remained tight. I understand, he said. But you must also understand me. That violin is not yours alone anymore. Now that its identity is known, the world will come for it. Collectors, thieves, investors, people who see nothing but dollar signs. This isn't a secret you can keep. You and your daughter will be targets the moment you step outside. The words made her stomach churn. She thought of the strange men lingering in parking lots, of how news traveled faster than she could run. She imagined waking in the night to find her door forced open, the quilt-wrapped violin stolen, Lily frightened and crying. Mercer's offer wasn't just temptation, it was a warning wrapped in silk. But still, her throat tightened. Why me? She asked. Why now? You've spent your life around instruments like this. Why wait until a single mother in Queens stumbles into your path? Mercer leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening, the weight of years visible in the lines around his eyes. Because that violin carries a story the world isn't ready to forget. It isn't just a Stradivarius, it's one of the missing pieces, thought to be lost forever. Its last documented appearance was almost a century ago, before wars and theft scattered treasures into shadows. To find it in your hands is nothing short of miraculous. He paused, his gaze unrelenting. And you, whether you like it or not, are now part of that story. The question is, will you carry it or let it bury you? Her pulse throbbed in her throat. Part of her wanted to say yes, to take the money and walk away, to choose survival over sentiment. But another part, the part shaped by her father's quiet dignity, told her that some things couldn't be measured in bank statements. She sat frozen, unable to answer, as Mercer's words carved themselves into her bones. That night, the apartment felt different, as though every shadow held a pair of watching eyes. Lily had curled up on the couch with her homework, later falling asleep mid-sentence with her cheek pressed against her notebook. Sarah dimmed the lamp and sat at the table, the violin case before her like a locked chest of secrets. The word Stradivarius, repeated in her mind, echoing, until it lost its meaning, and became only sound. Her father's face came to her unbidden, the faint smile he wore when he tuned the violin, the way his hands moved with patience and certainty. He had never boasted about what he owned, never hinted that what he guarded so carefully was anything more than an ordinary instrument. He had worked long hours fixing engines, taken extra shifts sweeping factory floors, patched roofs for neighbors in exchange for a few dollars. He had sacrificed endlessly, and through it all, the violin had remained in its case, waiting. How had he come to possess something so rare? Had he known its worth? Or had it simply been, to him, a tool for music, no matter the signature carved into its body? Sarah rose and retrieved an old shoebox from the closet. Inside lay the fragments of her family history. A few yellowed letters, some ticket stubs, photographs bent at the edges. She rifled through them with trembling hands until one photo slipped free. Her father stood in front of a grand theater, suit too large for his shoulders, violin case held proudly in one hand. On the back, in his neat block handwriting, were 4 words. For her future. Her breath caught. He had known. He must have known. All those years he had refused to sell it, no matter how badly they struggled, no matter how often his hands cracked from labor, no matter how thin the pantry shelves grew. He had held on to it for her. For Lily, for the future. Sarah pressed the photograph to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. Every odd job, every tired smile, every sacrifice had been to protect not just the violin, but what it meant. It wasn't just an heirloom. It wasn't just an investment. It was a voice carved into wood. Her father's dream solidified into something the world had almost forgotten. The weight of legacy pressed down on her until she thought she might collapse. She glanced at Lily, curled up with her hair tumbling across her cheek, and felt the truth settle deep in her bones. The violin wasn't hers to sell. It wasn't Mercer's to buy. It wasn't even fully her father's anymore. It was a gift, passed through time, a torch to be carried carefully, fiercely, until it reached the hands it was meant for. Protecting it might mean more than any amount of money Mercer could dangle in front of her. Protecting it might be the last way to honor the man who had given up everything to keep its secret safe. And as Sarah sat in the dim light, listening to the soft rhythm of her daughter's breathing, she knew one thing for certain. She could never trade her father's love for cash. Not now. Not ever. 2 days later, Sarah's phone would not stop buzzing. At first, she thought it was another late payment alert or some automated reminder she had forgotten to silence, but when she picked it up, her stomach dropped. Notifications piled across the screen. Dozens of missed calls, a flood of unread texts, emails pouring in from unknown senders, with subject lines like interested buyer and urgent inquiry. She swiped to her news feed, and there it was in bold letters splashed across the top of her screen. Single mom discovers lost Stradivarius. The words seemed unreal, like a cruel parody of her life. She scrolled further and saw photographs of herself taken from across the street, the blurred outline of Lily holding her backpack, even the shadow of the violin case visible against her hip. By mid-morning, reporters were outside the building, their cameras aimed at the cracked brick walls, waiting for her to step out like she was some kind of spectacle. A woman she had never seen before banged on her door, demanding a quote. When Sarah peered out the peephole, she saw microphones thrust forward like weapons, faces eager for a soundbite. She backed away, heart pounding. Neighbors who had barely spoken to her before now whispered in the stairwell when she passed, their voices carrying the thinly veiled envy of people who thought she had suddenly stumbled into wealth. $500,000, can you imagine? She overheard one mutter. Parents at Lily's school were worse. At drop-off, one mother leaned in with syrupy concern, asking, "So how much did you say it was worth again?" Another pressed, "Are you planning to sell? You'd be crazy not to." Sarah pulled Lily closer, ignoring the stares. The emails grew stranger by the hour. Collectors wrote with 6-figure offers, their words dripping with urgency. One even sent a picture of an empty briefcase, promising to fill it with cash if she met him at a hotel downtown that evening. A handwritten note slid under her apartment door that night, read simply, "Cash in hand." no questions asked. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. She crumpled it into the trash with shaking hands. Fear replaced the awe she had first felt in that rehearsal room. What had once seemed like a miracle now felt like a curse. The violin was no longer just an instrument. It was a beacon, calling out to everyone with greed in their hearts. She dialed Mercer with trembling fingers. When he answered, her voice cracked with fury. "You promised me privacy. You said you'd handle this." His tone was calm, maddeningly so. "Leaks happen, Mrs. Collins. An instrument like that cannot remain hidden. It is history, and people will claw at it until it's theirs. You must decide whether to fight or let go." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool wall, struggling to breathe. Outside, a camera flash lit up her blinds. Lily padded into the room in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Mom, why are people outside with cameras?" she asked softly. Sarah forced a smile, crouching to hold her close. "Because they don't understand," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "They think it belongs to everyone else. But it's ours, sweetheart. Yours and mine." Even as she said it, a pit formed in her stomach. Deep down, she knew Mercer was right. This storm wouldn't pass quietly. The violin had become both their salvation and their prison, a gilded cage from which there was no easy escape. It was just past midnight when Sarah finished her shift at the diner. Her feet ached from hours of standing, her hair smelled faintly of grease and coffee, and all she wanted was the quiet relief of her apartment. The parking lot was empty except for her aging car, parked beneath the lone flickering light. She walked faster, sensing the hollow silence pressing against her skin. That was when she saw them. Two figures crouched low beside the back seat of her car, shadows shifting with quick movements. Her breath caught. The violin. That was where she usually kept it, wrapped carefully in the quilt her mother had sewn years ago. Panic surged before she could think. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice breaking the silence like glass shattering. She charged forward without a plan, fear outpacing reason. The figures bolted, their footsteps slapping against the pavement. One stumbled, glancing back just long enough for her to catch the gleam of a hood pulled tight around his face. Then they disappeared into the darkness beyond the lot, swallowed by shadows. Her hands trembled as she yanked the car door open. The seat was empty. Her heart dropped into her stomach until memory jolted her. She had carried the violin upstairs that morning, unwilling to leave it behind while she worked. Relief swept through her in a dizzying rush, so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees. But relief didn't last. Terror replaced it almost instantly. Someone knew. Someone was watching closely enough to believe she might have left the violin in the car. They weren't after her purse or the loose change in the cup holder. They were after the instrument. She drove home with her pulse hammering, every shadow on the street a threat. When she called the police, her voice shook with urgency. The officer who arrived scribbled notes on a pad with casual disinterest. "Probably kids messing around," he muttered, snapping his notebook shut. "Nothing was taken, right? Nothing damaged?" "Nothing this time," Sarah snapped, her fear sharpening into anger. "But they were trying. Doesn't that matter?" The officer shrugged, already glancing toward his car. "We'll keep an eye out." His tone said otherwise. He left her standing in the hallway, arms wrapped tight around herself. That night, she shoved the couch against the door, the sound scraping across the floor loud enough to wake Lily. Her daughter blinked sleepily, confusion etched on her face. Sarah gathered her close on the mattress, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "No one's taking it from us," she murmured, her lips brushing Lily's hair. "I won't let them." But even as she said it, the darkness pressed closer, carrying the truth she couldn't escape. The violin was no longer safe here, neither were they. And with each passing day, the shadows waiting outside seemed to grow bolder. Mercer arrived the next morning without warning. Sarah heard the knock, steady and insistent, and her stomach tightened before she even opened the door. He filled the doorway like a shadow, his usual polished composure edged with something harsher now, urgency carved into his features. When she let him inside, he barely glanced at the cluttered apartment or the pile of unopened envelopes stacked on the counter. His eyes were fixed only on the violin case resting on the table. "Sarah," he said. his voice lower than usual, stripped of ceremony. "It's only a matter of time before someone succeeds. They will keep coming. They will break locks, cut doors, chase you through the night if they have to. I can stop that. Let me buy it. I'll place it in the Philharmonic's vault. It will be safe, preserved, played only by the finest hands in the world." Sarah's fingers tightened around the chair she stood behind. His words, though coated in reason, scraped against her ribs. "It's my father's," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to hold. "It's Lily's future. You don't understand." Something hardened in Mercer's eyes. The sympathy she had glimpsed in him before cooled into something distant, almost severe. "You think keeping it honors him?" he asked sharply. "No. Hiding it dishonors the music. That violin doesn't belong in this apartment. It doesn't belong locked away in fear. It belongs to the world." The words landed like blows. She wanted to believe him, to see the nobility in his argument, but doubt slithered into her veins. Was she selfish for clinging to it? Was she betraying her father's love by turning his treasure into a burden? Or was Mercer manipulating her with lofty ideals while dangling the promise of safety like bait on a hook? "I don't want the world," she said finally, her throat raw. "I want my daughter safe. I want to know we'll have a tomorrow. Isn't that enough?" Mercer exhaled, shaking his head slightly, as if she were a stubborn student refusing to learn. "You're standing at a crossroads, Sarah. You can choose to hold on to it and watch as danger circles closer each day. Or you can let it go, secure your future, and give the world what it deserves. But you cannot do both." When he left, the apartment seemed emptier than before, the silence heavy and accusing. She sat at the table, long after the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. The violin case lay closed in front of her, quiet but heavy with expectation. She reached out, tracing her fingers along the smooth wood beneath the quilt, feeling every groove, every curve, as if the instrument itself might answer the questions tearing her apart. $500,000 could change everything. It could erase every hardship, every hungry night, every anxious calculation over overdue bills. It could buy Lily a better life, the one her father had always wanted for her. Yet the thought of handing it over, watching Mercer walk away with the case, hollowed her chest. She lowered her head and whispered into the stillness, speaking to the man who had once played lullabies for her on that very violin. "You left this for me?" she murmured, tears catching in her voice. "I won't give it away so easily." Lily noticed, of course. Children always did. Sarah tried to mask the heaviness in her chest, the shadows under her eyes, but her daughter carried her own kind of wisdom innocence, sharpened into intuition by years of watching her mother fight against storms they had never asked for. One evening, as Sarah sat hunched over the table, sorting through bills that felt more like accusations than envelopes, Lily emerged quietly from her room. In her small hands, she carried the violin case, her fingers clumsy but careful. She set it gently in her mother's lap. "Play for me, Mom." Sarah looked up, startled, exhaustion etched into her face. "Honey, not tonight. Please," Lily whispered. Her eyes shone with a mix of hope and certainty, and something in that look pierced through Sarah's fatigue. She hesitated, then sighed, lifting the case onto the table. Her hands moved with reverence as she loosened the latches, drawing the violin from its nest of quilt and memory. When she placed it under her chin and raised the bow, the first notes wavered, raw and uncertain. But then her hands remembered what her heart had tried to forget. The sound grew stronger, richer, filling the cramped apartment with something larger than its walls could contain. The music rose and fell like the memory of laughter, like grief stitched into beauty, like love that refused to be silenced. Lily closed her eyes, swaying softly, her breathing slowing as though the notes had wrapped around her like a blanket. When the final chord faded, silence returned, heavy but tender. Lily opened her eyes, glistening, and whispered words that broke Sarah's heart wide open. "Grandpa's here when you play," she said, her voice trembling with certainty. "I can feel him." Sarah's chest ached. Out of the mouths of children came truths adults struggled to see. This wasn't just about money or danger. or collectors circling like vultures. It wasn't about Mercer's offers or the flashing headlines. It was about legacy. It was about memory. It was about love. Lily looked up at her again, innocent but wise, in a way no 12-year-old should have to be. "Don't sell it, Mom," she said softly. "It's ours. Grandpa wanted me to hear it one day. He wanted me to know music." The words sliced through every knot of doubt that had tangled in Sarah's chest. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her fiercely as though she could protect her from everything waiting outside their door. The violin rested on the table beside them, silent now but heavy with meaning. Sarah pressed her lips against Lily's hair, whispering a promise she felt in her bones. "I won't let it go. Not like this. Not ever." Her daughter had spoken what her heart already knew. The violin's true worth was not in the numbers collectors scribbled in desperate offers, not in Mercer's solemn arguments about the world, not even in the dizzying estimates appraisers had whispered. Its worth was in this moment, in the tears streaking her cheeks, in the way her daughter believed her grandfather's love could be heard through strings and wood. The violin was priceless, not because of what it could buy them, but because of what it had already given them. Proof that love endured, even in the darkest times. That night, when the building had gone quiet and the last murmurs of traffic faded outside, Sarah pulled the shoebox from the back of her closet. It was dented, its lid soft with years of wear, but inside it held the threads of her family's story. She set it on the kitchen table and lifted the lid with hands that shook, uncertain what she would find or what it might demand of her. Letters, yellowed and fragile, were stacked neatly, bound by string. The ink was fading, but her father's careful handwriting was unmistakable. She unfolded the first and saw her mother's name scrawled at the top. The words drew her in immediately. "I'm still saving for the Strad. It isn't easy, but every extra hour at the garage brings me closer. One day our child will know what it means to hold something timeless." Her chest tightened. He had spoken of it as if it were not merely an instrument but a destiny. Another letter mentioned wedding gigs, nights spent playing for strangers under cheap chandeliers, the money tucked away, never used for luxuries, always set aside to guard the violin. One letter, brittle with age, made her breath catch. "If anything happens to me, promise me Sarah will inherit the violin. Promise me it won't be lost to greed. Music must live in her blood." Her hands trembled as she pressed the page to her chest. Tears blurred the words, dripping onto the paper as though her grief could rewrite time. Her father had known the sacrifice he was making. He had worked endless shifts, his knuckles raw from engines, his voice hoarse from late-night performances, all to guard an instrument worth a fortune. And yet, he had never sold it. Even when the bills stacked high, even when groceries dwindled, even when Sarah herself needed things he couldn't afford, he had refused to trade it away. He had chosen legacy over luxury. He had chosen her future over his comfort. And now here she sat, staring at his words, holding the very thing he had preserved with his life's sweat, wondering if she was strong enough to live up to what he had carried. Guilt and gratitude warred in her chest. Guilt for the times she had resented his absences, not knowing he was protecting something for her. Gratitude that he had believed in her even when she had stopped believing in herself. The violin gleamed softly in the lamplight, its curves etched with centuries, its voice waiting. Could she live up to the sacrifice her father had made? Or would she falter, crushed beneath the same weight that had silenced his own dreams? She sat at the table until dawn, the letters spread around her like witnesses. Her father's voice seemed to echo in the room. "Promise me." And in the pale light of morning, she whispered into the quiet, "I promise, Dad. I'll keep it safe. I'll make it mean something." Yet, a part of her still feared she was too small for the task, too fragile to carry what he had guarded with such strength. Sarah thought she could trust Denise. The woman lived down the hall, laughed easily, and often looked after Lily when Sarah's shifts stretched too late into the night. She had seemed kind, her smile sympathetic when Sarah confided about bills, her presence a comfort in a world that felt increasingly unsafe. But desperation was a cruel sculptor. It carved masks away, until only raw hunger remained. That evening, Sarah returned from work exhausted, her apron still smelling faintly of fried food and coffee. She pushed open the apartment door, expecting to find Lily on the couch with her homework spread around her. Instead, her daughter was standing by the table, cheeks wet with tears, pointing at the empty surface. The violin case was gone. Panic erupted in Sarah's chest, hot and suffocating. She dropped her purse, rushing to Lily. "Where is it? What happened?" "Denise," Lily sobbed, hiccuping through tears. "She came in and said she needed to borrow it for something important. She promised to bring it back." Sarah's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. She tore out of the apartment and raced down the hall to Denise's door, slamming her fists against it. Silence. The landlord appeared from the stairwell, his face apologetic but firm. "She moved out suddenly," he said. "Left unpaid rent, didn't even give notice." Rage mixed with terror, twisting inside her. She called Mercer with trembling fingers, her voice sharp with panic. He listened, then promised he would send contacts immediately to track pawn shops and auction houses. "It won't travel far," he assured her. "People will notice it. We'll find it." Hours stretched, each one heavier than the last. Sarah paced the floor, her breath shallow, until the phone rang. A tip had come in. Denise had been spotted at a shady midtown shop trying to sell the violin for a fraction of its worth. Sarah and Mercer rushed there, the city blurring as they sped through traffic. When they arrived, her stomach turned. There was Denise, cornered near the counter, her hair damp with sweat, her hands shaking as she clutched the case. Security hovered nearby, the shopkeeper glaring at her. Sarah's knees nearly buckled at the sight. "Denise, how could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Denise's eyes were wild, desperate. "I needed money," she screamed, her voice echoing through the dim store. "You were sitting on a gold mine while we starved? Do you know what it's like to choose between rent and food? To watch everything collapse while you hoard something worth more than all of us combined?" Sarah wanted to rage, to scream back, but all she felt was hollow betrayal. This was the woman she had trusted with her daughter, trusted with her home. And now, she was trying to sell her father's legacy to the highest bidder. Mercer's contacts intervened, prying the case from Denise's grip. Sarah held it close, her hands shaking so badly she thought she might drop it. The wood felt colder than before, tainted by the violation. She turned away, unable to look at Denise's face as security led her out, still shouting accusations. Back on the street, Sarah hugged the case to her chest, her tears blurring the city lights. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected, deeper than she thought possible. It clarified a truth she had resisted. If someone this close, someone she had trusted like family, would steal from her, then no one could be trusted. The violin was more than a treasure now. It was a target, and everyone, neighbors, friends, even those who smiled kindly, could one day reveal teeth. Mercer had called it a rehearsal, but when Sarah stepped into the hall, it felt nothing short of sacred. The space was immense, larger than anything she had ever set foot in. The ceilings arched so high they seemed to cradle the echoes of every performance that had come before her. The rows of red velvet seats stretched endlessly into the darkness, and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and dust, as if the very walls remembered centuries of music. She froze, clutching the violin case in both hands, her knees threatening to buckle. "Play it," Mercer urged from the wings. His voice carried across the stage with the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. But there was something gentler underneath too, something that almost sounded like belief. "Let the world hear." Her heart hammered in her chest. The idea of standing there, alone under the glare of the stage lights, made her want to turn and run. She wasn't a performer. She was a waitress, a single mother who lived in a rundown apartment and scraped pennies together for gas. What right did she have to stand where legends had stood? She glanced at Lily, sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. Her daughter's face was a portrait of hope, eyes wide, lips curved in an encouraging smile. That look steadied her. It always did. Sarah drew a deep breath, walked to the center of the stage, and opened the case. The violin gleamed under the lights, as if it had been waiting for this moment, as if it belonged here more than she ever could. Her hands shook as she raised it to her chin. For a brief second she hesitated, the silence of the hall pressing down on her. Then she set bow to string. The sound that emerged silenced the storm inside her. It wasn't the hesitant squeak of rusty practice or the tentative tones she had played for Lily in their apartment. It was something alive, something vast. The notes soared upward, filling every corner of the hall, rich and resonant, as though the violin were breathing life into centuries long gone. She felt it vibrate through her chest, down to her bones, until she was no longer simply playing. It was as though the music had chosen her body as its vessel. She closed her eyes and let herself drown in it. The sorrow of her father's sacrifices threaded through the melody, each note mourning the life he had lived in silence. But triumph was there too, every bow stroke a declaration that he had not protected the violin in vain. She played one of his favorite pieces, the same one he used to hum under his breath when he thought no one was listening. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the sound rose higher, brighter, until she felt as though he was standing beside her, guiding her hands, whispering through the strings. When the final note faded, it hung in the air, a fragile echo refusing to let go. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Sarah lowered the bow slowly, chest heaving, her cheeks wet. For one terrible moment, she thought perhaps she had failed, that her unpolished hands had insulted the instrument's worth. Then the applause came. It was thunderous, shattering the silence in waves. Mercer clapped, his face set in a rare expression of satisfaction. But he was not the only one. Only then did Sarah notice the shadows in the back rows, the silhouettes of others Mercer had quietly invited. Critics, patrons, men and women whose words shaped reputations and whose donations built empires. They stood applauding. One leaned toward another and whispered, "She's not just holding history, she is history." The words reached her, echoing louder than the applause. For the first time, she felt the power of the instrument not as a burden, not as a curse pulling strangers to her door, but as a gift demanding to be shared, even if the thought of it terrified her. The next morning, the Philharmonic's offer arrived in crisp, official language. $500,000 wired immediately upon transfer of ownership. In addition, lifetime access for her and Lily to attend concerts, their names honored as patrons who had returned a priceless treasure to the world. On paper, it was perfect, clean, generous. An end to every sleepless night spent counting coins. But Sarah hesitated. She sat at the table with the papers in front of her, staring at the numbers that could change everything. She imagined the relief of paying off every debt, the joy of handing Lily a college acceptance letter with the certainty that it was already paid for, the comfort of walking into a home that was truly theirs. But then another image crept in: what it would feel like to hand over the violin, to close the case for the last time, to know she would never play it again. Mercer pressed her hard, his voice firm as ever. "Think of Lily's future. Think of your bills. Think of what $500,000 means in your hands instead of a piece of wood gathering dust in fear." His logic was undeniable. Money solved problems. Music did not, and yet her chest tightened every time she imagined letting it go. That night she pulled out the letters again, her father's handwriting steady and certain even after all these years. One line burned in her vision: music must live in her blood. He hadn't said, money must save her life. He had believed something deeper, something less tangible, but no less real. Sarah turned to Lily, who sat cross-legged on the couch with homework spread in front of her. "What do you want?" Sarah asked softly. Lily looked up, eyes wide, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "The violin. Mercer wants to buy it. The Philharmonic wants to keep it. But it isn't just mine. It was Grandpa's, and one day it'll be yours. So I need to know, what do you want?" Lily's answer was simple, her voice steady in a way only a child's could be. "I don't want to sell Grandpa." The tears came hot and sudden, blurring Sarah's vision. In that moment the decision crystallized. The offer, the promises, the pressure, it all fell away. She wouldn't sell. She couldn't. Not when the violin was more than wood and strings. Not when it carried love, sacrifice, and a legacy that had survived too much to be traded away. But she also knew she couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep shoving couches against doors and praying shadows would pass her by. She needed a way to honor the violin and protect her family at the same time. Somehow there had to be a middle path, a way to keep the music alive without destroying themselves in the process. The world wanted the Stradivarius, but Sarah realized, with a quiet fierceness, that she would decide how it would be heard. With Mercer's reluctant help, the plan unfolded like something fragile being stitched together with golden thread. Sarah had refused to sell, but she had also accepted that they could no longer live with the violin in their apartment, its presence a beacon to every shadow waiting outside their door. So Mercer proposed something different, something binding. The violin would remain hers by law, her name written clearly into a trust that protected it from collectors, thieves, and even the Philharmonic itself. It would live in custody with the Philharmonic, kept in a vault designed for treasures of history, its safety guaranteed by lawyers and contracts rather than padlocks and whispered promises. It would not be lost to the world, but neither would it be stolen from her. She listened carefully as Mercer described the arrangement, his voice clipped with irritation at her refusal to sell but tempered by an odd sort of respect. The Philharmonic would care for it. On special occasions, concerts marking milestones, anniversaries of music's great names, the violin would be taken from its resting place and played. Not just by the world's finest hands, but sometimes by her own. Sarah, the waitress who had once been told her father's violin was worth $10, would stand on a stage and play an instrument most musicians only dreamed of touching. The details were endless. Insurance for the full value, guaranteeing financial security no matter what storms life hurled their way. A clause that ensured Lily would inherit it one day, the legacy passed intact to her when Sarah's hands grew too old to guide the bow. Legal frameworks, thicker than any barrier Sarah had ever imagined, shielding the violin from greedy offers and shadowy threats. Mercer handled the lawyers, she handled the courage to say yes. When the story was released to the press, it was carefully worded. Single mother donates priceless violin to the people. The narrative painted her not as a seller cashing in, not as a recluse hoarding history, but as a woman who had sacrificed for the greater good while ensuring her family's safety. The public devoured it. Sympathy exploded like wildfire. News anchors called her courageous. Columnists hailed her decision as noble. Donations poured in from strangers who wanted to help her rebuild, enough to clear debts that had hung around her neck like chains, enough to move her and Lily into a home that finally felt safe. The collectors stopped circling once they realized the violin was untouchable by law. Their letters ceased, the knocks at her door quieted. For the first time in months, Sarah breathed, without the weight of dread pressing on her ribs. She had protected her father's dream. She had shielded her daughter from the darkness that had threatened them, and in doing so, she had found something she thought she had lost forever: hope. At night, when Lily curled against her in their new apartment, Sarah would look at the photograph of her father, violin in hand, and whisper into the quiet, "We did it, Dad. We kept the promise." And for the first time, the guilt that had clawed at her since discovering its worth eased. What she felt now was something else entirely: gratitude, fierce and luminous, that the weight of sacrifice no longer rested only on his shoulders. She carried it too, and together they had turned it into something stronger. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the stage at Lincoln Center, the weight of the bow in her hand steady, her heart no longer trembling with fear, but with something deeper belonging. The hall was filled to its highest tier, every seat occupied, yet in that moment she saw only one. Lily sat in the front row, her small frame wrapped in a simple white dress, her eyes glistening with tears she wasn't trying to hide. The violin rested against Sarah's chin, familiar now, no longer a burden but a partner. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and began to play the piece her father had once played in their tiny living room. The notes rang clear, pure, eternal. They soared into the rafters, swirled around chandeliers, pressed gently against the velvet seats, until the entire hall was wrapped in their embrace. It was not perfection, it was truth. Her father's truth, her own, Lily's, all stitched into music that had survived poverty, betrayal, fear, and still refused to be silenced. Tears blurred her vision, but her hands did not falter. Each note carried a memory, her father's calloused hands tightening a string, Lily's innocent whisper that she could feel her grandfather when she heard the music, the crushing humiliation of the pawn shop, the shadows that had chased them, the decision not to let it all be reduced to numbers on a check. Sorrow lived in the melody, but so did triumph, so did the fire of survival. When the final chord echoed, it hung in the air, as if the hall itself was reluctant to let it end. Then came the roar of sound. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, the thunder of applause shaking the walls. But Sarah's eyes found only Lily's. Her daughter clapped the loudest, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, her smile radiant with pride. Backstage, in the quiet, after the storm, Lily threw her arms around her. Her small voice trembled against her mother's ear. "One day, I'll play it too." Sarah pulled back enough to see the determination in her daughter's eyes. She smiled through her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart, you will." The Stradivarius was no longer just wood and strings. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was love carried forward from father to daughter, from mother to child. It was proof that some legacies could not be silenced, no matter how heavy the cost of carrying them. As Sarah stepped once more into the glow of the lights, violin in hand, she finally understood. She hadn't just saved an instrument, she had saved a legacy. One note, one sacrifice, one act of courage at a time. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. And in the comments below, share what legacy in your life you're determined to protect. Your story might inspire someone else today.